The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Terry Erzman. I'm introducing our speaker for today. We will be recording today's webinar. Thank you for attending. We'll send a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a link to the slides from today's webinar within the next 24 hours. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll answer as many of those as we have time for at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today. Greg is the product manager who leads the GridGain Web Console project, and he will be speaking about what's new in GridGain Web Console in 2019. Greg?
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everyone, for joining. My name is Greg Stachnick. I'm product manager at GridGain. I'm responsible for our cloud strategy as well as our development tools. And today we're going to be talking about our latest release of GridGain Web Console that came out just about 2 weeks ago exactly, actually. And this is our Web Console 2019 October release. So what we'll be talking about during this session is we'll do kind of a mixture of demo and slides. Just for people who aren't that familiar with Apache Ignite and GridGain, we'll give a bit of an overview of the runtime, the framework, the capabilities and use cases that it's trying to address. We'll talk about some of the key qualities that we would expect when we need to monitor a distributed system, like Apache Ignite. And then we'll get into the basics of the Web Console architecture, its core features, and then basically how it's distributed, installed, set up, and then we'll get into a demo. And then at the end, we'll do some Q&A and look at provide you with some additional resources. So, Apache Ignite and GridGain is a memory-centric data platform that is used to build fast and scalable and resilient solutions. It's used to provide speed and scale to new and existing data-centric applications, and the GridGain product is built upon Apache Ignite. If you're not familiar with Apache Ignite, it's an open source project. It's sponsored by GridGain. It's one of the most active projects in Apache. And it basically serves as the core for this distributed memory-centric solution. So some of the core use cases or features that we have as part of Ignite and GridGain is its distributed memory-centric storage. So it allows us to store giant data sets in memory. It supports co-located compute, so we can bring our computations to the servers where the data actually resides, which eliminates a lot of network bottlenecks. And then in terms of how we communicate with this data grid, we really support kind of two different ways. One is through key value APIs, and another, which is probably the more popular way that customers like or users like to interact with our grid, is through distributed SQL. And Apache Ignite and GridGain also support ACID transactions. So for people that are building applications to communicate with this data-centric or with this distributed memory grid, we support a number of client technologies, and it's really based around your language of preference. So we have clients that are supported based on Java, based on .NET, based on C++, PHP, and then if we don't have a language-specific client, you can always use REST. And then in terms of some of the common use cases that we see that are popular or with Ignite and GridGain, we see core banking services that tend to use GridGain applications or Ignite applications, real-time product pricing, reconciliation and risk calculation engines for like insurance, and analytics and machine learning. And built on top of this kind of core base of functionality provided by Ignite that we see kind of in the red, we add some additional enterprise level features in GridGain. That includes things like security and auditing, the ability to do rolling upgrades of our our grid so that we can have zero downtime updates to the applications, some enterprise connectors around Kafka, Golden Gate, Hadoop, data lakes. We also support the ability to replicate the grid and its data across different regions. And then we also build on top of Ignite Persistence to provide some additional enterprise features around snapshots, point-in-time recovery, things like that. So that's kind of the basics of the platform itself. And so let's also think about, if we're working with this platform, what are some of the expectations that we may have around monitoring and managing these applications? So things that we might expect out of a tool would be things like, oh, maybe to simplify the way that we configure and launch our clusters. Ignite and GridGain have a lot of different options around cluster configuration. And it can be maybe daunting the very first time that we define a cluster configuration by hand. And so wizards can help us get access to documentation and maybe just simplify the model so that we understand what we're configuring. Because this is a distributed memory-centric storage, we may want to have some tools to help us load and query our data. As the application is running, we may want to be able to monitor the metrics to analyze performance. And we also probably will want to be able to perform at least some basic administrative operations like start and stop and backup and things like that. For a monitoring system, we probably also want some way to define alerts and triggers based around specific conditions that we define. Because it's a distributed system, it can be tricky to go and access all of the logs and thread dumps across the different nodes in that cluster. And so tooling can also make that easier to access those from one central location. And then, of course, for these applications, we maybe want to be able to enable backup and recovery. And so GridGain and Ignite actually present these this data or these metrics via standard APIs. So any third-party tool that can support JMX can visualize these metrics from their application, from their grid and their caches. But GridGain also provides a technology-specific tool to help with the administration and monitoring of GridGain and Ignite applications, and it's called GridGain Web Console. So GridGain Web Console is a centralized environment. It helps us with configuring and managing and monitoring our Ignite and GridGain applications. And it gives us some basic capabilities to configure our clusters, preload data, perform queries, as well as manage and monitor some of the more enterprise features that GridGain provides. And we'll get into some of the details of each of those features when we get into the feature section. And we'll also talk about how we access the GridGain Web Console. We have really two options. We provide on-premise versions that you can download and run locally or set up as a private service within your data center. And we also have a hosted version. So let's talk about the Web Console architecture. And this is where we start to see some of the big changes that came in this October release. So at the most simple, there's really just kind of three types of components that are involved in order to manage and monitor GridGain or an Ignite cluster. One is the cluster, so we must have a cluster running somewhere. The second is an agent. So this is a Web Console specific basically script or small Java application that needs to run somewhere near the cluster. It doesn't necessarily have to run in the same VM as the cluster or the same process as the cluster, but it at least has to be able to have network access to that cluster. And that agent will then provide communication to our Web Console. The Web Console is a web application that provides all of the kind of the administration capabilities, and it does it in a kind of a web-based format. Past releases of Web Console were built on Node.js and required a third-party database in order to store its metadata and metrics and all of its other log information. And so in the past, that was required users to basically provide a MongoDB instance and manage that separately. We got feedback from customers that they didn't really like having to take this additional third-party dependency and manage it in order just to get access to, in order to use Web Console successfully. And so for the last, basically since the end of spring and through summer, we took on a major re-architecture of Web Console in order to kind of simplify its installation, simplify its architecture, and the result is this Web Console 2019 October release. So this is no longer a Node.js based application. It's now pure Java. It's built on Spring Boot. The configurations, the metadata, user profiles, all of that no longer requires a third-party database. We now use just Ignite persistence. And it's not something that you need to worry about as an end user. The reason I just mention it is it's actually an implementation detail, and you don't have to do anything to set that up. It's just that is the technology that we use now in order to store our metadata and manage logs and things like that. When Web Console was originally developed, it actually predated Ignite persistence. So that was why we had required this third-party database. But now that Ignite persistence is available, customers are using it in production. We've had a number of releases to kind of harden it. We now use it as our internal implementation for our tools as well. So the architecture is a big change in this release, and it should simplify how you use Web Console within your own applications, particularly if you're using it as a local development tool, because now you only just need the Web Console bundle or the Web Console Docker image, your web agent, and your local grid or your local cluster. You don't have to go and set up like another component like MongoDB locally in order to use our tools. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the core features of Web Console. And so first let's talk about cluster configuration. And so within Web Console, we provide some tools to help both with cluster configuration of Apache Ignite-based clusters, as well as GridGain-based clusters. And so that we see that in our configuration tab. And I'll be demoing that in a few minutes. But it basically allows us to efficiently create configuration files and code snippets for our GridGain and Ignite projects. And so this allows us to create clusters, caches. It gives us tools to import a domain model from really any relational database, as long as we can provide a JDBC driver. Some of the databases that we have certified against are Oracle, Postgres, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, and many more. That's just kind of a subset. And so when using the configuration tab, it's really kind of two sets of things that you might want to do. One is just creating your Ignite configuration. When working through a wizard, if you're not familiar with all of the individual configurations that you would need for Ignite or GridGain, it can be a lot easier to do it in a form. And with each of these, all the properties, we provide some context-sensitive help. We can give you some pointers to documentation, so it's just a lot easier to understand kind of how these configurations are set up. The other reason you might use the configuration tab is really for database import. And so when you're doing database import, you typically would install the web agent somewhere near your database, or at least so that the web agent can have access through the network to your database. And then we just kind of step you through creating basically an OR mapping of the database into some Ignite and GridGain caches. So it's a multi-step wizard once you connect to the database. So you basically just select your database tables, your database schema, and then how you want those tables to map to your Ignite caches. And then at the end of this multi-step wizard, we will generate the code that you can then run. So it's Java code. We'll provide with Maven POM file, and then we provide a few different configuration types, either Spring-based, Java-based. And then ultimately, if you wanted to load that data from that database into this new domain model that is built in Ignite, we give you some scripts to help do that data loading as well. So for new users, it's a very helpful way to get started to both create your configuration, create a topology of caches that map to your database, and then load data. Our developer-centric feature in GridGain Web Console is around querying. So we have a feature called SQL Notebooks that allows us to basically create SQL queries that are ANSI 99 compliant, which means we can support SQL functions, we can support aggregations, grouping, joins, all of those types of things. And so we'll do a demonstration of this as well. So if you're a developer and you're using our web console, this is besides just getting your grid set up, your caches set up, you probably would spend a lot of time running queries against your data. And that can be both, kind of a local copy of your data if you're doing local Ignite or GridGain development, or even connecting to a remote or your production version of the data. In addition to just running individual queries, we have the ability to do some monitoring of those queries. And this includes long-running queries. So if you have a query that's running over continuously or over a long period of time, we'll provide status of those long-running queries, so you can see kind of how long they've been executing, what those queries are doing. And then we also can track query history. And so in terms of query history, we'll provide the details of the query's execution, like its success and failure, how long it took to finish, and then we give you some ways to do some sorting and reporting and things like that. For an administrator, or someone that just needs to track the performance of their grid, the metrics dashboard is probably where you'll spend a lot of time. And so this is basically providing a visualization onto some of the key metrics that we get out of Apache Ignite and GridGain. These are metrics that are surfaced via JMX, of course. If you wanted the full list of metrics from JMX, you can look in our GridGain documentation for that list. But this is giving you basically some of the most important metrics and visualizing them in graphs and in tables. Some of the key metrics that we visualize in the metrics dashboard are your heap, your CPU usage, your memory. If you're using Ignite persistence, will give you some metrics around storage. If you're doing computations, we'll give you computation details, throughput, as well as latency between as the computations are running through the grid. In addition to just kind of statically viewing metrics, we also surface some actions so that we can perform operations on those caches and clusters. And that would be something that's very different that the web console provides that a third-party tool like, say, a Prometheus or a Kibana probably wouldn't provide. They'll be able to visualize some metrics that are coming out of Ignite and GridGain, but being able to maybe start and stop your caches, do rebalancing of data, provision, call garbage collection, collate the logs, call thread dumps. Some of those kind of more operations on the individual caches and clusters are something that I think are specific to Web Console because it's built for this Ignite and GridGain technology. Incidentally, the metrics dashboard, there are some new things. I'll talk about that when we talk about kind of packaging and pricing, but they're specific for Ignite and the GridGain Community Edition, which is basically our free users. Alerting. So that's something that we've built, we've expanded upon in this release. So if you're tracking metrics, you're viewing them, you may want to be able to set some alerts and triggers based around some metrics that we are observing in the system. So traditionally, we have been able to define metrics around kind of node discovery events. So a node joins, a node leaves, or maybe you're expecting your clusters to be of a specific size. And so if the cluster, falls below a certain threshold of nodes or caches, you may want to be alerted that maybe a cache, crashed unexpectedly and didn't come back up. And so you might want to go and take a look at it. Something new that we've added in this release, though, is a lot of new events and alerts that we can track for data center replication. Data center replication is a GridGain enterprise specific feature. It allows us to take basically a cluster and copy that topology and data into another cluster, whether it's in a different region, a different data center, something like that. And I'll talk about. I have some specific slides where we'll talk about data center replication. But what we were finding is that customers that were using data center replication wanted to get more details about the events that are happening as the data is being replicated from one location to the next. And so as we provided more event information in the data center replication tab, we also added alerts that we could set for those events. So some examples of some of the new alerts that we've added around data center replication are things like when a remote node has connected, either from the sender or the receiver side, when it's disconnected. We've added more events to track the replication events. So when a cache has started sending its data over to its receivers, when replication started, when it has stopped, when it has paused and resumed, we can set alerts around those. During our initial replication, we'll be performing a full state transfer in order to take all of the data from our starting cluster and copying it over into the receiving cluster. So when full state transfer has started or stopped, or whether there's been any error events during full state transfer, we can now define alerts for that. And then if the data center replication store has had an error for any reason, whether data has been corrupted or we've run out of space and we're starting to get an overflow event, we can define alerts for those as well. And in terms of alerts, it really comes in three different forms. We provide alerts in the UI itself. So we will basically have like a bell icon that will pop up within Web Console. We can set email-based alerts. So we can set up email to a distribution list with details about the event. And we can also configure SMS as an alert. For using Ignite persistence, we may want to use a feature called baseline topology. So Ignite enforces this baseline topology concept, which represents a set of server nodes in the cluster that will persist data on the disk. Usually when a cluster is started for the first time with Ignite persistence, the cluster will be considered inactive, which will block your kind of common CRUD operations. And this is typically done to prevent performance or consistency issues. And so when we're starting Ignite with an Ignite cluster that's using persistence, we'll want to define a baseline topology for the cluster. And then this will help maintain some consistency if we're doing like restarts of nodes and things like that. And so typically you enable baseline topology at the configuration level. And then Web Console can help us track and manage that baseline topology. So we can activate and deactivate baseline topology-based clusters. We can add new nodes to the topology, and we can stop and remove nodes that are participating in a baseline topology. Rolling upgrades is also an enterprise feature for GridGain. And the idea behind rolling upgrades is that we're basically allowing different versions of GridGain to coexist in a cluster. And it can help facilitate an upgrade between GridGain versions. So if I'm running, say, some of my nodes are GridGain 8.5, and I want to upgrade them to 8.7, I can use the rolling upgrade feature to go through each node in my cluster and do an upgrade event. And so let me talk about how the actual workflow is. So let's say we have our current cluster is 858, and we want to upgrade it to 8.5.10. So I would provide both versions of the runtime. I would initiate a rolling upgrade. This will go into each individual cache, and it will stop a cache. It will rebalance the data that was in that cache across the rest of the caches or rest of the nodes in that cluster. We'll then take that cache and stop it, upgrade it, and restart it, and then we'll rebalance the data across these caches again. And rolling upgrade will basically go sequentially through all of the nodes in our cluster, and one by one, rebalance, take down, upgrade, rejoin, and rebalance. So this allows us to do basically an upgrade of an application without requiring a cluster restart. So it's a way of doing like a zero downtime upgrade between GridGain versions. One thing to note is that we cannot currently upgrade between major versions of GridGain. So if I was on, say, GridGain 7 and I wanted to upgrade to GridGain 8, then that's not supported. And there are some other additional restrictions around kind of what can and what can't be upgraded, and you can find that in the documentation. But it's a very useful feature to kind of do zero downtime upgrades of our caches and clusters, and Web Console can facilitate that operation. Another new feature, another area of Web Console that we've added a bunch of new features is around snapshots. Snapshots is another enterprise feature for GridGain Ultimate Edition. And it allows us to basically take advantage of Ignite persistence, but in order to save state for recovery, point-in-time recovery, and things like that. So through the Web Console snapshots view, we can create snapshots, we can schedule snapshots, we can manage our snapshots, and then we can basically restore to our grid to one of those snapshots that we had recorded. So some of the new things that we've added to the existing snapshot capability in Web Console is that when we're creating snapshots, we can now add compression. If there's a concern about storage consumption of these snapshots, that compression can help alleviate some of those issues. The snapshot scheduler traditionally was wizard-based. We now also support cron expressions so that we can have a little bit more flexibility in how we define this, how snapshots are run. For example, maybe you have kind of two schedules. Maybe you're doing a full state snapshot that's happening nightly, and then maybe we're doing incremental snapshots that are happening more frequently, like hourly or something like that. It's a lot easier to do that just by defining a really short cron expression. We can always manage and view existing snapshots through Web Console. And then we can also now do a state restore through the point-in-time recovery. That's also a new thing that we've added in the Web Console 2019 October release. Let's see, so data center replication. I think that's the last of the enterprise features we'll be talking about, yes. And then we'll get into some demos. So data center replication is, I've talked about it a little bit already in terms of alerting. It's often used basically to take a topology of clusters and basically recreate it over in another location and copy the data. So some customers use it. So it supports both active-active and active-passive data replication. Some common use cases would be things like taking the data set and mirroring it in multiple locations if we want to take advantage of like high availability. We may also be using it for failover. So, you know, we have a copy of the data in two different sets of clusters in two different regions, and if one region goes down, then we can, through load balancing, redirect the traffic to that other environment without data loss. And some new features. This was an area that we did a lot of improvements, both in the runtime as well as in the tooling. A few of the improvements that we made to Web Console data center replication is the ability to pause and resume the transfer process. We added some additional data center replication configurations, or well, we added most of them now to the configuration screen, so that you don't have to go directly into the XML to configure your data center replication properties. And then I also mentioned that we added data center replication alerts, but just individual states of the process as it's going from our receiver nodes, transferring the data, or sorry, from our sender nodes, as the data transfers into our sender hubs, as the data goes over to our receiver hubs and then gets distributed into our receiver nodes. At each step in that process, we are now providing more details about the events so that you have much more information to understand how the data center replication process is working visually within the Web Console. And so let's talk about how, kind of what features are available and how we get access to Web Console. So Web Console 2019 October release is totally free. That's actually something new for this version. In the past, you could get some subset of the Web Console tooling from Ignite, but you had to build it yourself from source. And you only could view the configuration in SQL screens. And then if you were an enterprise GridGain user, you could get Web Console on-premise, but you had to have a license. And then we also provided a hosted version of Web Console, console.gridgain.com, which would give you access to all the UI, but we would only surface features or only enable features based on the license. So it was sort of like we had like 2 or 3 different versions of Web Console. Starting in this release, as part of this re-architecture that we underwent, now there's only one version of Web Console. Totally free and easily to get access to in one of 3 ways. You can still go to console.gridgain.com, which is a free, centrally managed, hosted version of our Web Console. Create an account, connect, install Web Agent locally wherever your clusters reside, and you can have a very easy way to work with the Web Console. We also now provide freely available on-premise versions. If you prefer to work in kind of more of a traditional bare metal environment, You just grab a zip. We produce Web Console as a simple zip that you can just unzip and run. No additional configuration required besides grabbing the web agent and running that as well. If you use Docker and want to use Docker locally, we now provide Web Console for free in a public Docker Hub repository. It's in the GridGain repository, and you can freely get that. We've architected the Docker version of Web Console to actually be two images. The back end and then the web front end are actually two different Docker would be two different containers. So we provide you with a sample compose file that you can very simply download and just run Docker compose up, and that will pull down the images and run them wherever you want. We also support deployment through Kubernetes if you want to run Web Console and allow Kubernetes to manage the instance. And that's all documented in our new documentation that shows how you can walk through all of those things. So let's talk about the features. So a new thing that we added in this Web Console 2019 October release is dashboard metrics we've now made available to everyone. So if you're running in Apache Ignite, or if you're running the free GridGain Community Edition, you can connect to your clusters, whether they're Ignite-based or GridGain-based. We give you access to the configuration screen, so you can define new clusters. You can pull, you can create a domain model from a database. We can use it to populate data from the database. We give you the query screen, so that what we call SQL Notebooks, which is kind of more of a developer-centric feature. So you can define your queries, run them against your Ignite or GridGain clusters. And then we also have added the metrics dashboard. So now an Ignite user can also view metrics, perform basic operations on their caches and clusters, and basically get all of the at least the basic administrative functionality for free. If you are a GridGain Enterprise user, we will also add or activate the rolling upgrades, as well as data center replication feature in Web Console. And then if you're using GridGain Ultimate Edition, we activate the Snapshots view. The idea is that with Web Console, we will give you all of the features. You can view all of them, regardless of what version of the grid that you're accessing, but we will activate those features based on the license, basically, that we detect of the connected grid. From Web Console, you could have a mixture of some Ignite clusters that are connected, some GridGain Enterprise clusters that are connected, an Ultimate Edition cluster that's connected of different versions, but one Web Console can manage all of those. So we've really tried to simplify the way that we distribute the product. We make it easier for everyone to get. And it's really just like one single unified UI experience that we activate and deactivate features based on what's connecting. A new thing that we've also introduced in this version of Web Console is support for backward compatibility. Traditionally, you would take the Web Console version that is most closely maps to your version of GridGain. So if I was running my applications in GridGain 8.5.4, I would get Web Console 8.5.4. If I was running Ignite 2.5, or say 2.7. something, I would build from source that version from that branch in the repository. That is no longer the case. Now from Web Console, we've certified against all of the currently supported versions of GridGain and past versions of Apache Ignite. So all versions of Ignite 2.7, Ignite 2.5.0, GridGain 8.4.4 and higher, which is still an officially supported version, all versions of 8.5, and all versions of 8.7. So we're really trying to make it so that you only really need one version of the tools to work with your applications. Okay, let's take a look at a demo. So I am going to, let's see, do I have things? Okay, I have everything stopped. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start Web Console. And I'm running locally, just to give you a little bit of some basics about my setup. So I have downloaded the Web Console direct install zip. I've unzipped it locally into my local drive. And all I did was I just launched webconsole.sh. Okay. And so let's go into a browser. Localhost. Okay, so what do I see? I see I have no connected clusters. So let's go and start some things. So we had talked about the key components of Web Console architecture. That is the Web Console web application. It's built on Spring Boot. We also need to start our web agent. So I'm going to launch that as well. Because I'm running everything locally, I'm going to run web agent local as well. And now let's start a grid. So I'm going to just start the basic ignite.sh example. Okay, so what do we see? We see web agent is now connected. And so let's refresh. And let's just say local host 3000. And let's add another guy. Great, so now we see we've got two things. And let's just start a whole new session. Great, so now we see we've got some clusters. Okay, so if I was new to Ignite and GridGain, I may want to use our configuration tab in order to kind of get started creating a cluster. And so that's very easy. I can just go into configuration. I say create a cluster. We have some of just the basic steps. So, you know, what is, how am I doing discovery? What's the IP address? What's the name that I want to give my cluster? What are the caches that I want to add? So let's just create one. We'll call this cache 1. We'll create another cache. We'll call this cache 2. And then if I had some advanced features that I need to configure, I can do that as well. And basically we separate the advanced features. These are all, the first 3 tabs are features that are supported by Apache Ignite and GridGain Community Edition. And then if we have some enterprise features that we want to enable, such as rolling upgrades or snapshots or data center replication, those are found under the GridGain tab. And so let's create these caches, add a new cache, and then I can just save and download. And this will ask me where I want to download this cluster project. And this will give me a zip of the source files and a POM so that I can just build this cluster and launch. The other thing I may want to do is import from a database. And so if I have a local database running, which I don't in this case, we actually have some past webinars that talk about importing databases, and you can, I would highly encourage that you go and view one of those to kind of walk through the details of how this works. But basically I need to have a JDBC driver available in my web agent, for my web agent in the JDBC drivers folder, and I need to be able to connect to that database. So we will provide the JDBC connection information, and then it will connect, and then we can go into the tables and schemas and map those to cache files. Okay, so that's the basics of configuration. Another thing, if I'm an administrator, then I may want to use our dashboard. So this is the dashboard view, and this is what allows us to view metrics and perform some basic administrative operations on our Ignite and our GridGain clusters. So we can see here we're starting to collect some information from these 2 clusters that I have running. So we're getting some cache usage metrics, some sizes. We can see the nodes that have been created. And if I want to get some details about, say, this node here, F934B336, I can go into the operations. I can pull down the logs. So this is giving us the streaming logs that are coming from that individual cache. I can go in and run the garbage collection. I can get a thread dump. This will show me all of the threads that are running for this cache. I can select individual threads and get the dumps for each of those threads. Incidentally, you can always do this as well from command line by logging into each individual node, but this is just giving us kind of an easier way to access that data. And a feedback item that we've received from customers is they'd actually like to be able to kind of collate all of those logs into an individual bundle as well as their thread dumps. That's not something that we have support for today. You would still just be pulling logs individually from each node in your cluster, but we are looking to add that in one of our upcoming versions to just basically say, give me a zip of everything, and then we can pull in all of the logs in one location. Sometimes that's useful, especially if you run into some sort of instability and you need to debug things. We can get into memory consumption, and then if I was using Ignite Persistence, I can get some persistence information as well. I'm going to switch to a mode that we call demo mode, and that is basically going to restart, it's going to start some additional clusters on my local environment and then connect to them so we have some more data that we can work with. This is what we call demo mode. It limits some of the operations that we can perform with Web Console. For example, we can't define alerts when we're running in demo mode, but it does have some more information set up. For example, it has more nodes configured. It's using Ignite Persistence, so we can see some of the details about the data size, how the write-ahead log performance is running, some of the time it's taking to save the data. We can see some of the cache details. I can get into the details of any of those caches just by clicking on the hyperlink, and that will pull in the configuration details for that cache. And I can also perform additional operations around caches as well. So I can go and define my partitions. I can start and stop some of my caches. I can rebalance the data across the caches that are related to car, for example. And then this demo mode is also generating some load, so we can view the computations as they're kind of streaming into the system. Because we're using Ignite Persistence, we've also defined some baseline topologies for the demo mode. So this is giving us some view as to how the baseline topologies are configured. We can activate them and deactivate them. We can sort them by type and by node ID, things like that. So as a developer, I may use Web Console to do querying against my clusters and caches. And so I'm going to switch into SQL Notebooks and perform some queries. And so we kind of define, or we kind of organize the SQL Notebooks into running of individual SQL operations, tracking the query history as it's executing through our caches, and then monitoring long-running queries to give you details about kind of performance and statistics. So I have one notebook that's already been created, and so we have a few queries that have been defined here. One is just kind of select the number of cars that's in this cache, and this is set to run on a 3-second interval. So then we can see, based on the load that we're running from those computations, we can see that the card count goes up and down. We have different ways to monitor it, either in a tabular format or different kind of data visualizations. We have simple queries, which is I can just execute ad hoc. We have some examples of some joins, where we can execute these as well and get some details. And we can also just define our own queries. For example, here, maybe I'll just create a new query here, and notice we get some content assist based on SQL. And then we can just do a quick run. And so we can see some of the details. So we can, basically dump out all of the data that's being stored in the country cache. And so the SQL Notebooks allows us to define as many queries as we want. We can do, and it's basically giving us, it's a full editing environment and run environment for ANSI 99 SQL. Some additional features that aren't configured for demo mode, but we probably set up some additional sessions in the future to talk about, are things about how we work with snapshots, how we work data replication, and how we perform rolling upgrades across our clusters. Another thing to note that I should have mentioned early on is that once I run Web Console, I also need to run an agent. You can get agent one of two ways. One is we include the agent in the Web Console download. Another is once we have Web Console running, we can download the agent directly from Web Console. And the difference between using just the standard shipped agent and the one that we download through the UI is that there's a authorization token that we need to set between the agent and the Web Console so that the two can connect and kind of authenticate each other. And if we download through the UI, we will pre-populate with that token. I can get to the token details here in my user profile, and here, this is the security token. I'm going to switch over. I believe I have got the Web Console. Yeah, so the web agent has a default properties file that we can configure, and I can see that by using just the downloaded agent from Web Console, it pre-populated my token. Otherwise, I would have to add a comma-separated list of the tokens that I'm running, that I've configured for my Web Console. We also provide some help links. So there's a little bit of a getting started guide. There's some links to get into our documentation, our forums, webinars, white papers, all of those types of things that you can access through the GridGain.com resources section. It's a good way to kind of get started, get into some tutorials, or learn some new concepts. So let's get back into our slides. So that's it for the basics of the demo. So what did we do? I did basically a local use case using the direct install zip version. I downloaded my zip, I unzipped it, I ran Web Console locally, I started my web agent, and then I started a couple of local GridGain nodes. One was using just the default configuration, and then one had set up a couple of caches. And then we went into Web Console, we looked at configurations, we looked at how we can monitor those caches to the dashboard, we performed some SQL, and then we also looked at some more interesting data that we can access via the demo mode application. So we're getting toward the end of our time. Let's open this up for questions if anyone has any.
Okay, Greg, we have a couple questions. First of all,
Okay, great.
what versions is the console available for? Which Ignite or GridGain version?
So yeah, let's go back to that slide. So this is basically we support. This is new only in the current in this new version of Web Console, which is our October release. Is we now support backward compatibility of both GridGain and Ignite. So if I launch Web Console 2019.10, I can connect in Apache Ignite 2.5 and 2.7 clusters. I can also manage GridGain 8.4, 8.5, and 8.7, and I can actually have all of those versions connected to one instance of Web Console.
Okay. Second question. Can I run the console on a member server, or does it need to be a dedicated box?
Yeah, it's flexible. So you can, it's really up to you how you want to run it. If you want to run as part of kind of more of a bare metal installation, you just download the zip and you can run it wherever you want. If you're using containers or Kubernetes, you would just pull in the compose file and run it as part of that. In our next release, we'll also publish some example Helm charts to help you configure running Web Console on Kubernetes.
Okay.
So yeah, there's no restrictions.
Which editions, which GridGain editions does it run with?
So we support all editions actually. So that was the really cool thing about kind of this new architecture, is that from this one version of Web Console, we will give you, you can view all of the different features that are available all the way up through GridGain Ultimate Edition. So you can see snapshots, you can learn about data center replication that's available in Enterprise Edition, you can learn about rolling upgrades, even if you're an Ignite user. So one Web Console, and it supports all of the different editions, including Apache Ignite. And then we activate features based on what we detect the connected cluster is. So if it's an Ignite cluster that's connecting to Web Console, you'll get access to the configuration, SQL queries, and dashboards. If then you connect with a cluster that is Enterprise Edition, then we will activate rolling upgrades and data center replication for that cluster. So it's actually very flexible.
Okay. What support is there for authentication for logging into Web Console?
So we support HTTPS and SSH, and we have all of the kind of security configuration information available in our documentation. Okay,
very good. I believe that's all the questions for right now. We will post the recording of today's webinar and also the slides from today's webinar on our website within the next 24 hours, and you will receive an email letting you know when that information is available. Please feel free to pass this on to your colleagues as well if you'd like them to be able to learn a little bit more about Web Console from today's information as well. Thank you, Greg, and thanks everyone.
And one more thing, everyone, just before we leave, I just want to highlight some of these resources. So if you go to gridgain.com and go to the download section, you can get downloads of GridGain as well as our Web Console tooling. IMCS is our conference. It's happening next month. If you're interested in attending or learning more about it, go to imcssummit.org. And then we have some links to other useful resources. We just launched a new site, which is GridGain Developer Portal. And this is a way for developers to get access to tutorials, white papers, use case documents, as well as documentation. We just also completely revamped our documentation site. So you can also get access to that there.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.